And now it's my pleasure to introduce Anne. Anne Lewis is a senior advisor for technology delivery at the Small Business Administration, focusing on service delivery, systems integration, procurement, and all the places where policy implementation intersect with technology. She is a tech industry veteran, passionate about helping decision makers better understand their technology, and she is currently based in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Anne.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with the Drupal community today. And today we're going to be talking about hacking bureaucracy with human-centered design tactics. So here's a brief overview of who I am. So I wish I could see this live, but show of hands, who loves bureaucracy? I'll pretend like I see nobody raising their hand here. Bureaucracy is something that emerges in very complex, very large structures of human beings who are all trying to work together for some common purpose. And I think we're all familiar with some ways in which bureaucracy makes program delivery, and in particular tech system delivery, harder. So let's talk a little bit about how the government is structured, what the emerging characteristics of bureaucracy are, and then how we can use human-centered design tactics to cut through some of the bureaucratic anti-patterns and actually get stuff done. Governing depends on trusted networks of advisors. And I'm sure none of you are surprised to hear this, as you all work in government. But when you elect a political candidate, like a president, you're technically electing a person, but you're also technically electing a container system for values that that person is held accountable to, and then the 100 people that this person trusts. And then these 100 people each have their own 100 people that they trust, and together this network of people figure out how to connect with subject matter experts, get information to prepare decision makers, push decision making. And the unit of communication, as I'm sure many of you have seen before, is the memo, which is an encapsulated summary of something that you should pay attention to and how it can inform a decision. And then decisions themselves typically show up in our work as policy. Policy implementation is typically performed by agencies. So you have the White House and you have Congress, who are coming up with ideas of what America should be doing and then making laws that then in turn create programs. And most of these programs end up getting assigned to government agencies like the Small Business Administration. Agencies then work to deliver programs and make a bunch of decisions along the way, typically additional policy decisions. And then at some point, these policy decisions start to intersect with the product management involved in shipping a tech system. To get all this done, agencies accumulate implementation infrastructure over time. So this is staff, money, expertise, lots and lots of systems. And when policymakers are trying to negotiate with agencies or talk to them about what different things can happen in the future, typically they only talk in terms of money. So successful discussions or negotiations yield more money and resources for the agency, but still the burden is on the agency to figure out, how do we actually get this program out the door that serves American citizens? This creates this sort of accumulation over time of different systems with lots of money, typically creates significant potential capacity, but also typically ownership of different pieces and parts of these systems, especially across agencies, is pretty distributed and pretty diffuse. And there's whenever people disagree, it's also pretty easy to hire a consultant to help you figure out what your decisions should be. So those are some characteristics of how government is like shaped and structured. And then this in turn creates bureaucracy that becomes a hard set of problems to deal with. So in many government agencies, there are aspects of the command and control, communication and management structure that you would typically see in military organizations. And then coming from this idea, hierarchy becomes really, really important. So people working in agencies are very aware of where they sit in the hierarchy, who's above them, who they need to delegate to, who they need to defer to, et cetera. And then it's easy to add processes and policies and new layers of rules. It's very difficult to remove anything. So you typically tend to see lots and lots and lots of rules accumulate over time, sometimes to the point of not making sense anymore. And then this dictates how you can actually build systems and deliver new programs. So this creates a handful of problematic things that make it hard, in particular, to ship new technologies. Decision-making with, I would argue, all large groups of human beings is inefficient and could be better. Human beings, we're just not that great at making decisions. And when you put us in positions of hierarchy and high stakes projects, A lot of times people will balk at making decisions, and then in government in particular, they're constantly looking for an authority to defer to, or wisdom from the past, or wisdom buried in someone else's emails or policy memos, etc. And so it becomes difficult to create a culture of decision makers who can own decisions. Lack of ownership is also an issue, as many agencies need to work together to put together complex systems of programs that deliver services to the American people. And then within each agency, it's a huge sprawling bureaucracy with diffuse and complex ownership. Because of the nature of agency work, there are many, many internal stakeholders who all have their own agendas. Some people are focused on just delivering this one thing that's an emergency now. Some people are focused on infrastructure building in a particular way long term. And there are always in large bureaucracies going to be people who are interested in building their own power. So you have lots of stakeholders, and they have many conflicting goals. And then in the same way that it's easy to add rules to the never-ending binder of rules and hard to delete anything, processes are hard to move forward and very easy to stall out. So this is the nature of government bureaucracy, and you might think, oh my gosh, why would anybody want to deal with this? Well, the impact of getting anything done in government is absolutely incredible and huge. Just at the Small Business Administration, for example, in the last year or so, the agency has delivered close to $1 trillion of economic aid into vulnerable sectors of the economy. So if you can figure out how to hack the bureaucracy to get things done, you can have a huge positive impact on the American people. So how do you deal with bureaucracy? How do you fix some of these anti-patterns? Now, before we start talking about ways of fixing it, I'm going to go over a few things that I would have thought would have been useful maybe 10 years ago. You might think might be useful, but end up being counterintuitively not useful in this particular context. So as technologists, sometimes we think, okay, well, here's a really broken, annoying system that doesn't work very well. Clearly, we should migrate this to the new hot framework, or migrate some of our old front end to like React or something. And while modern web frameworks and software engineering paradigms are better in many ways, especially from the perspective of developer productivity, it's still easy to build a bad website that doesn't do the right thing, unfortunately. So it's important to look into the existing program that you're working with and try and understand what are the root causes of the problematic behavior that you see, and look beyond just what you as a technologist can control, because sometimes bad product management will yield bad results no matter how great your technology choices are. Another thing to pay attention to here is, since it's easy to suggest, well, this is a terrible, nasty mess of code that I inherited, I'd like to migrate it to this other thing. Legacy system migrations are expensive. They're hard to pull off. They're hard to pull off within a particular timeline. And given the timeline of government budgeting and projects and like the 4 or 8 year presidential leadership terms that cause the leadership of agencies to rotate out and then change priorities, it's pretty easy for legacy system migration projects to become politically weaponized within an agency and say like, oh, well, this person said to try and migrate this to Drupal, but it took them 2 years, they didn't get it done. So we're going to set all of the stuff they built on fire, take their budget and do something else with it. Which is like heartbreaking when you see it happen. So anyway, it's important to watch out for, are you choosing the right solution to the problem based on the understanding of the root cause of the problem? Bureaucracies have all kinds of crazy, unexpected root causes of problems. And then this is something that comes up in the tech industry a lot too. If you see 15 competing standards, this XKCD cartoon kind of speaks for itself here. And you try and solve them all by coming up with a new standard, suddenly you have N+1 competing standards. So this goes back to the idea that government makes it easy to accumulate new processes and protocols and systems, very difficult to actually delete anything. So beware of coming up with the idea of the protocol that'll rule them all before understanding what problems you need to solve. So how do we solve the right problems? This is where human-centered design comes in. Regardless of your background, from like systems engineer to designer, you've probably heard of this and heard it described in a bunch of different contexts as a new shiny way of thinking about project development. But I propose that the greatest utility that human-centered design has is in helping us figure out how to solve the right problems, which is great for when you have a huge sprawling system with so much user-facing surface area, you couldn't possibly go through the backlog of every possible thing to fix. And it's great for governments where you have so much bureaucratic complexity, it's hard to figure out how to get basically anything done. And it can also be a helpful antidote for some problematic tech culture norms. Like, I'm sure you've all worked on tech teams where there's a core of tech people who think they know better than everyone else, and they're kind of like intellectual bullies, or they simply they want to build a thing, and therefore that's the thing we're going to build, regardless of what users want. So human-centered design gives you a collection of tactics that help you center on your users. First of all, you have to know who they are and what they care about and what they need, and then center decision-making on what users need, and then broaden that sense of decision-making across all of the systems that touch the user's experience. It's a good fit as a methodology to fit into agile software development methodologies, because it also embraces this idea of rapid and iterative prototyping. All right, so here are some hacks. I'm hoping to trick you into being interested in management techniques here by calling them hacks. So the first hack is we want to reorient decision-making to users as opposed to whichever stakeholders were running the show before. Create ownership where it's lacking. Don't lose track of why we're building this when we're actually building it. And then at a high level, manage to outcomes instead of outputs. They feel like bureaucracy, says Nika. Yeah, fair enough. All right, reorienting to users. So I'm guessing everyone here has been in a situation where you're on some program team that is afraid of making decisions and kind of goes in circles endlessly. Probably the most annoying version of this is endless meetings where everyone goes around in a circle and says, well, I don't know what to do. What do you want to do? Until everyone runs out of energy. So a team that hesitates to make decisions, there can be a variety of reasons for this. They may not feel empowered. They may not know what it is they're supposed to be working on. Maybe the priorities of the group that they're working in haven't been clearly communicated. Maybe there are some culture problems. Maybe people are afraid of retribution. And then in government in particular, one way of stalling making decisions is to endlessly search for some external authority to defer to. So I think this is an opportunity, even though it's an annoying situation to be in. It's an opportunity to notice, hey, this team is having trouble making these decisions, and then to reorient the decision-making processes to the perspective of the user. So this is what I would hope anyone would do in a situation where you find an indecision. It's always helpful to scope the problem so that everybody knows they're not making a huge choice that will have ramifications far beyond this one particular dev task or project. So scope the problem, define the decision criteria, what's a good enough decision, and then assign a next step that involves some form of listening to users. So you may have never talked to your users before. Maybe that means figuring out ways to actually interact with them or listen to them, either by talking to them directly, interviewing them, or listening with data and seeing what they do on your web properties. There are a bunch of different tactics that are helpful here, including creating a user experience map. And I definitely recommend this O'Reilly book, Rapid Techniques for Mapping Experiences. There's a lot of helpful tools and tactics here that could help you feel armed with ideas about what to do based on the situation that you're in. So reframe that decision away from what does this external authority thing, or what am I not going to get in trouble for doing, into like, who are our users, what's best for them, what do they tell us they need, what do we see that they need, and why. Another problematic team situation that can happen in bureaucratic groups is lack of ownership. So that might mean that everybody sort of owns something, but nobody really owns it when there's a problem with it. It can also mean ownership of systems is spread across different groups, like different agencies or different offices that maybe don't have a functional working relationship or any way of collaborating. This can happen in a lot of different ways, but you typically know when it's happening, when something breaks and it's not clear who is able to fix it or allowed to fix it or knows how to fix it. So one bureaucracy hack that is helpful here is using service design thinking to create that organizational ownership. And the way that you do that is you map out the service blueprint for all the services that interface with the users to do the thing that you're trying to do, and then label and name who's involved and make it visual. So let's talk a little bit about service blueprints. So everybody here has probably heard of products and product development. It's the thing that you're building that users interact with. Services are kind of like a meta level up from products. They're the human, digital, and physical interactions that happen over time with products that create a user's aggregate experience. And service design thinking is getting everyone involved in that map to understand how they are interrelated with other systems and owners that impact users. So as an example, a government example, irs.gov/refunds. That's a website you can use to check the status of your refund. The service involved here, the meta layer up from this, is the aggregate experience that users have with all relevant IRS tax systems and processes. Some of them are websites, some of them are paper forms, some of them are the customer support line they called when something happened they didn't understand, etc. All of these systems and processes that achieve the user's goal of getting their tax returns. So what you can do is figure out, when you identify a goal like getting tax returns, you can interview users and figure out what are all the different touch points of the ways in which they're interacting with government agencies and products and systems and services to get this done. And you can make a map that visualizes the relationships between the different service components. This screenshot here, you probably can't see it very well, but if you just Google free Miro service blueprint, you'll find this exact thing. And the thing that this is doing here is it's making visible the relationships between service components. And in agencies, this is products owned by many agencies and teams. So on one axis, you have the things that the users are doing, the things they're interacting with, and then the cells of the table are the interactions themselves. It sounds like a simple thing, but making this complexity visible can go a long way in helping people develop shared language and be able to negotiate with each other to figure out how to fix things when you need to fix things. So when you make this complexity visible, you can then create ownership in a couple different ways. And this will depend on your project and your situation. But ultimately, you want to align on roles. So who owns which pieces of these things, and make sure that that ownership set is as small as it needs to be actionable. Then you can figure out what your definition of done is, not just in the context of your particular product and the thing it does, the cell on that spreadsheet, but rather like who is affecting it and what does it affect, and get a general sense of, okay, here's how I'm operating within this system. And then this helps you do practical things like ensure that the user acceptance tests that you happen to have written for changes for your cell on that sheet are taking into account the downstream impacts. Hack number 3 is don't lose track of why you're building something. It's pretty easy when you get into the details of development to get super focused on implementation or just making sure that the particular user stories you've been assigned are actually completed. And then it's pretty easy for a whole bunch of smart people with good intentions to get together and accidentally build the wrong thing that does not meet users' needs. This happens in government, I would say, most of the time. So the bureaucracy hack here is to create processes that connect a user-centric definition of why with your existing agile software development methodologies. So I'm sure you guys have all experienced this heartbreaking situation. You have a really cool sounding project that starts with carefully articulated goals, product development work. Maybe you even have designers involved and they've all gotten together and come up with a strategy and a theory of what to build, and they've written some good user stories. The developers dive in and start implementing these user stories, and then for some reason goals change. In the last year, the thing that changed a lot of project plans here in the government is the pandemic. All of a sudden, whatever it was you were doing before is less important than delivering billions of dollars of economic aid now, so that people don't lose their homes, their livelihoods, their businesses, etc. So for some reason, the project's goals change in ways that are that don't fit in with your particular agile cadence. The project starts running out of time by definition of the new emergency. External stakeholders who do not know what a website is create pressure on you to finish building your thing. Developers and PMs get kind of defensive and are like, well, don't get mad at me. I'm just following my orders here. Everyone gets a little bit literal when it comes to interpreting the user story descriptions to be like, no, I did this. I did my part. Don't yell at me. And then in aggregate, everyone starts, because they are forced to, cutting corners. They build and deliver a thing that may or may not actually do the thing that users need. And then everybody gets mad at everybody anyway. So tragedies. One way to mitigate the risk of this is to connect your agile project management strategy, whatever it may be. And I'm not saying there's any right or wrong way of doing this or right or wrong set of project management tools to use. Connect it with your service blueprint. So user stories describe what it is you're building at a granular implementable level. Developers define how we're going to build it. The service blueprint describes the why. And it's helpful to have this written down in a way that visualizes the complexity for all of the non-technical stakeholders who are going to show up and try and figure out what's going on and create urgency. So making sure that why is connected just in some way to the what, and it might just be like you have a project board somewhere that shows the blueprint alongside the the particular sprint's burn down or backlog, etc. Any way of visualizing these things together can helpfully connect why with what, so that when developers are sort of forced into tough situations and told to like build these 7 things, they can then see like, well, if I build just these 3 things, but then pull in this other user story, even though that's not what we originally intended, it'll achieve this goal that we've articulated. It can help everyone work together when scope needs to be renegotiated in urgent situations. The service blueprint can also help you make sure that your definitions of done actually make sense, and like make sure that if, you know, when you have to limit the amount of time that you spend testing, that you're able to test the right things that impact users. The fourth and final hack here is manage outcomes instead of outputs. This might sound like boring manager talk, but it's very important, especially when it's so easy to accidentally build the wrong thing at a very large scale in the complexity of government bureaucracy. So I'm sure everyone has also been in team environments where you've noticed that some folks do performative work. So they really make a show of, you know, instead of delivering code, delivering lots of words that make it seem like they're doing lots of work, but it's mostly just to make it seem like, oh, I want to get partial credit for showing up. So this is a dynamic that happens when there's a lack of clarity or indecision from management or from the forces that control the project team. And, you know, there's a variety of different reasons why you might have lack of clarity or indecision. But it's typically something that can only get worse over time unless you reorient the team. If it becomes clear to the people who are doing all of the work that other people are getting partial credit for performative work that is bad for morale, it makes it difficult to track your team's velocity, etc. So one way to sort of like reframe this and make it less of a potential risk is to define your project outcomes. This is more advice for like a higher level program manager. The outcomes for your project are the lived experiences of users that happen as the result of delivering this particular service. You can think of them as like your user-centric program axioms that various iterations or collections of user stories are derived from. They hopefully should be informed by some contact with users or understanding of users or tracking of user goals. And they should be stated simply enough that all of your non-technical stakeholders can say, you know, understand what they are. Like one litmus test for this in government is, are they talking points that your comms team can deliver comfortably? So when you align on project outcomes, which, you know, and as an example with the SBA would be, you know, we've been assigned $20 billion to deliver into this grant program, and it all has to be out the door in a couple of months. So that means it needs to be possible to apply for grants, process grants, and then deliver grant money by this timeline. And so that means all these steps in between then need to have timelines that make sense, and we need to be able to audit our process along the way. I mean, it sounds simple, but it's pretty easy to procure a vendor who then starts on a path of defining all possible ways in which you could build an application and website that could take 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years. And so like having outcomes that constrain the scope and the impact on users is important to rein in some of those dynamics. It doesn't mean dictating timelines, but in this particular case, like if you deliver $20 million to businesses that are going to go out of business in 4 months, you do it in 3 months, success. You do it in 7 months, fail, because the businesses have gone out of business for a bunch of reasons we can track. So it's helpful to like clarify those outcomes and then repeat them like a drumbeat, especially if you have really, really large vendored out teams who may be more focused on their internal processes than on the impact of the work that they're doing on your user base. And let's see, I meant to save hack number 4 here. So another place where it's important to think about managing to outcomes is when within your developer team, you start to argue about software process or framework choice. So when there's indecision or pressure or a feeling of like inefficient management, sometimes developers deal with this indecision to try and focus on something they can control, which is typically software process and sometimes language and framework choice. But, you know, no matter how much you control the process, if you're not building the right thing, it doesn't matter. You can excellently build the wrong thing in the same way that you can accidentally build the wrong thing. So from a manager's perspective, it's important to like have an empowered set of technical decision makers who can control and modify their own software processes as needed. But these processes all need to be in service of user-centric outcomes. All software processes need to drive to these outcomes as non-negotiables. And then, how to get there is something that the team can talk about. It's really easy to spend lots and lots of time. I've seen this go on for years with tech teams fighting about software process and going back and forth and back and forth. And from a manager's perspective, this is really dangerous. I mean, your team might have good intentions, but like we discussed earlier with legacy migrations, it's easy for things like this to not be understood by non-technical decision makers and then weaponized. And it's easy to say to someone who's doing budget management who doesn't really understand what the tech team is doing, to be like, well, what did you guys just spend the last 2 years on? When in fact you were very earnestly and rigorously evolving your software process over time. So as a team leader or a manager or high-level tech executive, it's important to make sure that all of these process decisions are contained by something that is connected to user-centric outcomes. All right, so in summary, it's very easy to attempt to solve the wrong problems in government, potentially spend years and millions of dollars doing this. To make better use of taxpayer dollars, we can use the principles of human-centered design to reorient planning and project work around users first, create necessary ownership of the products that together make up a service framework, and make it clear who's owning which pieces, but also that everyone is in this interdependent system that directly impacts users. We want to make sure that impact to users isn't lost in the fog of program management or in the lost in translation with devs, and make sure that everyone involved in the process is managing to a set of outcomes that everybody understands and is aligned with. All right, any questions? As you're thinking about whether you, go ahead, Nika, sorry.
Yeah, so how would you go about doing that? Prioritizing the needs to different stakeholder groups.
Prioritizing, the question is, how do you prioritize competing needs from different stakeholders?
Yes.
I think you start with establishing shared language around your user base, and that the point of everyone's work is to serve users. And so there are a couple different ways of doing that. Experience mapping is one, journey mapping is another. It's possible that your non-technical stakeholders with their competing goals have never even thought about what does the thing that we're building do and for who. So sometimes you have to spend a significant amount of time building up that context with them so that they're empowered to, even if they still have a different or opposing agenda, frame their agenda in the context of the project's goals and the user's goals. One dynamic that I see happen a lot in government, since lots of people are involved in transmitting information and very few people are subject matter experts, is that you can get a lot of people talking about a project and have no idea what it is. That happens, I don't know, with all of the ARP programs that I've worked on delivering. There's 75 people in a room of 90 people, and they're all talking about the blah, blah, blah website, and nobody has any idea what that does. So empowering people with shared context and shared language can create the framework for then negotiating priorities. And the person, at least in government, with the clearest talking points usually wins. So that becomes a communication challenge. And then once everyone's oriented in the direction of the same goals, prioritization becomes more straightforward.
Okay. I don't see many questions early on, but I see us just talking about the bureaucracy when you deal with government and ATOs dealing with those. And, yeah. Anybody else have questions? Oh. Do you have any hacks for getting stakeholders to actually define expectations? Often I feel the stakeholders know something, but they don't articulate it.
Yeah, that's a common feeling. So when I was a developer, I was pretty sure that all the high-level stakeholders were hiding things from us. And then when I became a technology executive, I realized most people have no clue what's going on at all, even about the things that they're supposed to be in charge of. So I think that not defining expectations usually means it's not clear to the high level decision makers that you're waiting on them for expectations. So there's been several layers of management planning or strategy or communication fail. And then the way to bridge those gaps, so that could be a depressing situation, or it could be an opportunity to inject ideas into your friendly local high level decision makers. So the place you start there is clear communication. So you find who your highest level accessible decision maker is, set up some time with them, and say, hey, tell me, like, you could frame the conversation in an open-ended way that's, like, tell me about what you're thinking, or, give me a mentoring conversation, or can I pitch this idea to you? Any way to get the conversation started. And then you can get a sense from them of, like, are they aware that there are people blocked on decisions? Yes, no. If the answer is no, then that's an opportunity for you to, from a bottom-up way, propose high-level expectations that can then get institutionalized. And it might feel like weird and backwards when you're doing it, but any place where there's a void of decision-making is an opportunity for you to step up and help do more of that decision-making. It's also a way of practicing being higher up the org chart if you're actually interested in climbing up it longer term by doing some of the planning work that appears to be missing. So that's those are the hacks I would recommend. Figure out who's supposed to be in charge of making decisions and isn't. See what they actually know about what it is they need to be making decisions on. And then if it seems like they have no clue, start suggesting stuff.
And I see Elijah says, as an engineer working on va.gov for the past 3 years, I really related to a lot of what you said. Gonna rewatch this talk. This is almost like required watching for all new hires within the government.
Thanks, Elijah, and really appreciate everyone at va.gov's work, especially through the pandemic. You had some really killer breakthrough apps and website development that I saw come through, like the SMS-based vaccine scheduling. So really appreciate all your service.
Alex is asking, how do you identify user needs without time-consuming user research?
I guess it's helpful to think about user research not as a big mountain to climb once, but as a set of practices to get everyone comfortable doing, to roll out iteratively. In the same way that it's dangerous to say, I'm going to go off and do a build, for 7 months and then come back and show everyone my masterpiece that nobody likes because they forgot I was building it. So the key there is getting iterative, and that'll reduce the time that it feels like that feels like you have to spend to get something useful.
And Stephen says, leading from the bottom is a great technique for advocacy.
If nobody has questions, I also welcome rants or bureaucracy hacking therapy time if anybody feels like sharing.
We just did that with the ATO often that you have to fill out, complete when you're delivering software. That's like a big bureaucracy pain point. So, what should we do when the high-level stakeholders undo the work of a project team in late phases in a project, close to launch, because they don't understand user-centric design at all?
Heartbreaking. Sorry you have to deal with that. Typically that happens because the person who made that call doesn't understand the costs involved. So I would start with neutrally, diplomatically documenting the costs. And since this is a big reveal of bad news, do it in a one-on-one way and not in a big meeting. So if there are 1 or 2 high-level stakeholders that you think have just reversed course that wiped out a whole bunch of project progress, communicate that to them one-on-one. And you can sometimes position yourself to be the friendly tech whisperer of an in-charge non-technical person who's maybe afraid to ask bigger questions about what would be the impact of this decision to the group, and see if you can build a relationship there and help empower them with the information that they need to understand the costs involved in their decisions. And then describe not just the costs, but the positive impacts of their choice on users, and also the positive impacts of what you had been previously building on users, and then frame it for them as a choice point. A lot of times high-level decision makers, especially in government where no one's a subject matter expert but has to make 1,000 decisions about stuff that requires expertise all the time, they rely heavily on people who can frame choice points for them and make it clear, here's the cost-benefit analysis, or here are the trade-offs. That's a really helpful skill to practice anyway, but I would try out practicing that skill on the person who just changed course on your project in that tragic way.
So Josh says first of all, he needs more viewing. but who should we be following on Twitter or podcasts? Who should we be?
Who? Let's see. Oh, wow. Do you mind if I answer that async and do a big roundup of people, of GovTech people I'm following on Twitter? That'll also give me some time to be slightly more interesting on Twitter than I have been the last couple months.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to send that around.
Sure. And Elijah asks, would you be up for a community chat about bureaucracy hacking at a later date with a more interactive QA format?
Sure, happy to. Love this community.
He said we could do a live broadcast. This is a really big topic that many engineers think is outside of their area of responsibility, but all engineers really need to be versed in this skill set.
Agree, Elijah. And I think the bureaucracy hacking techniques will vary from agency to agency. Every agency does things differently in the US government. But ultimately, you're practicing leadership skills that you can either use as an individual contributor to help your executives do the right things or not do the wrong things. Or, it's a way of practicing, like, would you ever consider being in charge of that level in the future? A lot of individual contributors think, I don't want to have to deal with that. It's all meetings and no code. But it feels pretty intellectually glorious when you're able to either prevent a train wreck from happening or like create the conditions for like not just yourself, but like 1,000 other developers to be able to work productively on things that matter. So worth practicing those skill sets and considering those future career steps.
Okay, so definitely follow Anne on Twitter. And I want to give another thank you for being our Thursday keynote.
Great. Thank you so much, Drupal community. It's great to see all of you, and I look forward to talking to you more about bureaucracy hacking on Twitter or in these QA forums.
So our sessions will resume today at 2:15 Eastern Standard Time and tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Tanika Watson will be stakeholder engagement innovation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you again, everyone.